You watch confident people effortlessly charm rooms while you stand in the corner, knowing you have valuable ideas but unable to share them because your shyness feels like an impenetrable wall. Every networking event becomes torture. Every meeting where you should speak up becomes a missed opportunity. And you're tired of being overlooked simply because extroverts dominate the conversation. I am Dale Carnegie, and I transformed from a shy farm boy terrified of public speaking into someone who taught millions how to win friends and influence people. What I've discovered about overcoming shyness while remaining authentically yourself will change how you connect with others forever. The principles I'll share aren't about becoming fake or pushy. They're about unlocking the likable person you already are beneath the social anxiety. Whether you're in boardrooms or coffee shops, these techniques work because they're built on genuine human connection, not artificial charm. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment below where you're watching from. Let me take you back to my childhood on a poor farm in Missouri, where I learned that being shy wasn't just uncomfortably, was devastating. I was that awkward kid who stammered when adults asked simple questions, who hid behind my mother's skirts when visitors came calling, and who would rather feed the pigs than face a room full of people. My family had no money, which meant I wore patched clothes to school and carried lunch in a tin bucket while other kids had store-bought everything. But worse than being poor was being invisible. In school, I watched the confident children raise their hands eagerly, their voices clear and strong as they answered questions I knew just as well. I had the answers, often better ones, but my throat would close up the moment I considered speaking. Teachers began to assume I was slow rather than shy, and classmates barely noticed I existed. I became the boy who sat in the back corner, praying never to be called upon, living in constant fear of attention. The turning point came during my freshman year at Warrensburg State Teachers College. I had managed to scrape together enough money for tuition, but I couldn't afford room and board, so I lived at home and rode horseback 11 miles each way to campus. Even there, poverty set me apart. While other students socialized in dormitories, I rushed home after classes to help with farm chores. I was already an outsider before my shyness even had a chance to isolate me further. But it was the required public speaking class that nearly broke me. Professor Winship announced that every student would give a speech to the entire class. Remember sitting in that room, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs as he explained the assignment. Other students groaned or laughed nervously, but I felt genuine terror. The thought of standing before 30 pairs of eyes, having my voice heard by 30 people who might judge me, reject me, or worse, laugh at me was paralyzing. When my turn came, I stood on trembling legs and walked to the front of the classroom. I had prepared meticulously, writing and rewriting my speech about farming techniques. But the moment I faced my classmates, every word vanished from my mind. My mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. Sweat dripped down my back. Despite the cool autumn weather, someone in the back row snickered, and that small sound shattered what little composure I had left. I stammered through perhaps 2 sentences before Professor Winship mercifully dismissed me. I stumbled back to my seat, my face burning with shame, while whispers followed me like a trail of humiliation. That night, I seriously considered dropping out of college. How could someone who couldn't speak to 30 people ever hope to teach them? How could I ever amount to anything when my own voice betrayed me? But lying in my narrow bed that night, listening to the wind howl across the Missouri plains, something shifted inside me. I realized that my shyness wasn't just hurting me, was robbing the world of whatever I might contribute. I had ideas worth sharing, perspectives shaped by hardship that might help others. But fear was keeping them locked inside me, like treasure buried so deep it would never see light. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I would not let shyness be my life sentence. I didn't know how yet, But I would find a way to transform this weakness into strength, this liability into an asset. I would learn to connect with people not despite my natural temperament, but because of the sensitivity and empathy it had given me. Little did I know that this humiliating failure would become the foundation of everything I would later teach about human relations and influence. The breakthrough came in the most unexpected place, a drama class that I enrolled in purely by accident. I had signed up thinking it was a literature course, and by the time I realized my mistake, it was too late to withdraw without losing my tuition money. I considered this yet another example of my tendency to bumble through life, but it turned out to be the most important mistake I ever made. Professor Jessup was unlike any teacher I had encountered. She was a former actress who had performed on stages in New York before coming to teach at our small Missouri college. She had an energy that filled rooms and a way of looking at people that made them feel both seen and appreciated. When she announced that we would spend the semester performing scenes from various plays, I felt that familiar knot of terror form in my stomach. But something curious happened during our first exercise. Professor Jessup had us perform a simple scene where we pretended to be someone else, entirely a confident businessman negotiating a deal. She handed me a script and told me to become this character completely. Don't be Dale Carnegie playing a businessman, she instructed. Be the businessman. Think his thoughts, feel his feelings, adopt his posture and his voice. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to be confident. As I embodied this fictional character, something magical occurred. My voice grew stronger, my posture straightened, and words flowed from my mouth with an ease I had never experienced. I wasn't Dale Carnegie, the shy farm boy who stammered and sweated. I was someone else entirely, someone who had every right to take up space and be heard. When the scene ended, my classmates actually applauded. Professor Jessup smiled and said something that would echo in my mind for years. Mr. Carnegie, you just proved that confidence is not something you are born with, it's something you can choose to wear. Like putting on a costume. This revelation hit me like lightning. If I could be confident while pretending to be someone else, perhaps I could learn to be confident as myself. Maybe the difference between shy people and confident people wasn't some innate quality I lacked, but simply a set of behaviors and attitudes that could be learned, practiced, and eventually internalized. I threw myself into that drama class with an intensity that surprised everyone, including myself. I volunteered for every scene, practiced my lines until I could recite them in my sleep, and studied the confident characters I portrayed as if they were real people I needed to understand. Each role taught me something new about the mechanics of confidence, how confident people stood, how they used their voices, how they made eye contact, how they moved through space as if they belonged there. The most profound lesson came when I realized that many of the most compelling characters I played were not the loudest or most extroverted. Some of the most magnetic personalities were quiet, thoughtful people who drew others in through their depth and authenticity. I learned that there were many different ways to be confident, and that my natural tendency toward observation and reflection could actually be strengths rather than weaknesses. Professor Jessup began giving me more challenging roles, and with each performance, I felt myself growing stronger. I started to understand that charisma wasn't about being the most talkative person in the room. It was about being genuinely present with other people, about making them feel valued and understood. These were things that my sensitive nature had always made me good at. I just hadn't recognized them as valuable social skills. By the end of the semester, something fundamental had shifted. I still felt nervous before speaking in public, but now I knew that nervousness and effectiveness could coexist. I had discovered that confidence wasn't the absence of fear, it was the willingness to act in spite of fear. More importantly, I had learned that the very sensitivity that made me shy also made me more attuned to other people's feelings and needs. The drama class had given me more than just performance skills. It had given me a laboratory for experimenting with different versions of myself. I began to realize that personality wasn't fixed, that I could consciously choose how to show up in the world. This was the beginning of my understanding that likability wasn't about changing who you are, it was about learning to express who you are in ways that connect with others. The drama class had shown me that confidence was possible, but I needed a way to practice these new skills in private before attempting them in public. That's when I developed what I came to call the mirror method, technique that would become the foundation of my transformation from shy farm boy to effective communicator. Every morning before dawn, while my family still slept, I would slip into the small bathroom we shared and stand before the cracked mirror that hung above our wash basin. I had discovered that shy people like myself needed a safe space to experiment with confidence, and there was no safer space than alone with my own reflection. I started by simply looking at myself, freely looking. Most shy people avoid eye contact, even with themselves. We're so accustomed to looking down, looking away, looking anywhere but directly at another person's eyes that we've never learned the power of steady, kind eye contact. I forced myself to hold my own gaze, to see myself as someone worthy of attention and respect. Then I began practicing conversations. I would imagine I was at a social gathering, meeting someone new. "Hello, I'm Dale Carnegie," I would say to my reflection, extending my hand as if to shake hands with myself. At first, my voice sounded thin and uncertain, even in the privacy of that small room. But gradually, through daily practice, it grew stronger and more natural. I practiced introducing myself in different contexts, at business meetings, at social gatherings, at church functions. I rehearsed answers to common questions. What do you do? Where are you from? How do you know our host? I discovered that much of my social anxiety came from fear of the unknown. So I prepared for as many scenarios as I could imagine. But the most powerful part of the mirror method wasn't practicing what to sit, was practicing how to think. I had to confront the constant stream of self-criticism that ran through my mind. "They'll think I'm boring," I would tell myself. "I have nothing interesting to say. Why would anyone want to talk to me?" Standing before that mirror, I learned to catch these destructive thoughts and replace them with more helpful ones. Instead of "they'll think I'm boring," I practiced thinking, "I have unique experiences and perspectives to share." Instead of "I have nothing interesting to say," I reminded myself, "I can learn something interesting from every person I meet." Instead of "why would anyone want to talk to me," I practiced believing, "people appreciate genuine interest and kindness." This internal work was perhaps the most important part of my transformation. I realized that shy people often defeat themselves before they even enter a social situation. We're so busy imagining all the ways we might fail that we never give ourselves a chance to succeed. The mirror became my training ground for positive self-talk, for building an internal foundation of self-worth that could support external confidence. I also practiced physical presence. I studied how confident people stood and moved, and I rehearsed these postures until they felt natural. I practiced walking into a room as if I belonged there, sitting down as if I had every right to take up space, standing to speak as if what I had to say was worth hearing. Most importantly, I practiced being genuinely interested in others. I would imagine conversations where I was completely focused on learning about the other person rather than worrying about how I was coming across. I rehearsed questions that would draw people out, that would make them feel valued and understood. The mirror sessions became a daily ritual that lasted well beyond my college years. Even as I gained confidence in public speaking and social situations, I continued to use private practice as a way to prepare for important conversations, challenging meetings, or new social situations. This method worked because it allowed me to build confidence incrementally in a completely safe environment. I could make mistakes, try different approaches, and refine my social skills without any risk of embarrassment or rejection. By the time I encountered these situations in real life, I had already experienced them dozens of times in my imagination. The mirror method taught me that confidence is largely a matter of preparation and practice. Shy people often think that confident people are naturally gifted, but I learned that most social skills can be developed through deliberate practice. Just like any other skill, the real breakthrough in my understanding of human connection came during my first teaching job at the YMCA in Kansas City. I had been hired to teach public speaking courses, despite still struggling with my own confidence. It was during one particular evening class that I discovered the secret that would transform not only my own social abilities, but eventually help millions of others. I had a student named Frank, a burly warehouse foreman who claimed he wasn't the talking type. He sat in the back row with his arms crossed, radiating skepticism about the entire enterprise. For weeks, he participated reluctantly, giving short, stilted speeches that revealed nothing about his personality or experiences. I was beginning to think I was failing him as a teacher. Then one evening, instead of launching into my prepared lesson, I decided to try something different. I walked over to Frank and said, "I've been wondering about something. You mentioned you work at a warehouse. What's the most challenging part of managing all those men?" Something shifted in Frank's expression. His arms uncrossed. He leaned forward slightly, and he began to talk, not about public speaking techniques or communication theory, but about the real challenges he faced every day, coordinating shipments, motivating tired workers, dealing with difficult customers. As he spoke, his voice grew stronger and more animated. This wasn't the hesitant man who had been struggling through assigned speeches. This was a natural leader sharing his expertise. I found myself genuinely fascinated by his insights. I asked follow-up questions. How do you handle it when shipments are delayed? What motivates your best workers? How do you deal with conflict between team members? The more interested I became in his world, the more he opened up. Other students began leaning in, asking their own questions. Frank, who had been the most reluctant speaker in the class, was now holding the entire group's attention effortlessly. That night, I realized I had discovered something profound. The secret to overcoming shyness wasn't to become more interesting, it was to become more interested. When I focused entirely on learning about Frank's experiences, my own self-consciousness disappeared completely. I wasn't worried about what I would say next or how I was coming across. I was genuinely curious about his world. This revelation revolutionized my approach to social interaction. I began experimenting with genuine curiosity in every conversation. Instead of preparing clever remarks or worrying about being entertaining, I started each interaction with a simple question: what can I learn from this person? The results were remarkable. When I approached conversations with authentic interest in others, several things happened simultaneously. First, my own anxiety diminished dramatically because I was no longer focused on myself. Second, people responded with enthusiasm because they could sense my genuine curiosity. Third, conversations became naturally engaging because people love to share their experiences and expertise when they feel truly heard. I discovered that everyone, no matter how ordinary they might seem, has fascinating stories and unique perspectives if you know how to draw them out. The warehouse foreman had insights about leadership that could apply to any industry. A shy secretary had developed innovative systems for organization that could help anyone be more efficient. A farmer had wisdom about patience and persistence that could transform how someone approached any long-term goal. This shift from self-focus to other-focus became the cornerstone of my social philosophy. I learned that shy people actually have a natural advantage here because we're often more observant and attuned to others' feelings than naturally gregarious people. While extroverts might be thinking about what they'll say next, introverts are often noticing subtle cues about how others are feeling and what they might need. I began teaching my students that the fastest way to become interesting is to be interested. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care about them, their experiences, their challenges, and their dreams. When you approach conversations with genuine curiosity rather than performance anxiety, you create an environment where real connection can flourish. This principle worked because it aligned with fundamental human psychology. Everyone wants to feel valued and understood. When you give someone your complete attention and ask thoughtful questions about their experiences, you're giving them a gift that few people receive in our distracted, self-centered world. I learned one of my most powerful lessons about human nature from Charles Schwab, the steel magnate who built one of America's largest corporations. When I had the opportunity to interview him years later, he shared a story that perfectly illustrated why remembering names is perhaps the most important social skill anyone can develop. Schwab told me about an executive in his company who had been struggling to advance despite obvious intelligence and competence. This man knew the steel business inside and out, worked longer hours than anyone else, and consistently delivered excellent results. Yet he remained stuck in middle management, while less qualified men were promoted around him. One day, Schwab decided to observe this executive during a company meeting. He watched as the man presented brilliant insights about market trends and operational improvements. But Schwab noticed something telling. When addressing his colleagues, the executive never used their names. He would say, "As you mentioned earlier, ... instead of, "As you mentioned earlier, Johnson ... or "That's a good point ... instead of "That's a good point, Miller ... After the meeting, Schwab pulled the executive aside and gave him what seemed like simple advice. For the next month, I want you to make it your mission to remember and use every person's name in every interaction you have. Don't just remember names, use them deliberately and naturally in conversation." The executive was skeptical but agreed to try. Within 6 months, his career trajectory had completely changed. He was promoted twice in the following year and eventually became one of Schwab's most trusted vice presidents. The only thing that had changed was his commitment to learning and using names. This story fascinated me because it revealed something profound about human psychology. A person's name is, to them, the sweetest and most important sound in any language. When you remember and use someone's name, you're sending a powerful message. You matter enough for me to make the effort to remember who you are. I began studying this phenomenon in my own interactions. I discovered that most people, especially shy people like myself, tend to avoid using names because they're afraid of mispronouncing them or forgetting them. We think it's safer to avoid the risk entirely, but this supposed safety actually costs us enormous opportunities for connection. I developed a systematic approach to mastering names that any shy person can use. First, when someone introduces themselves, I repeat their name. Immediately, "Nice to meet you, Margaret." This serves two purposes: help cement the name in my memory, and it gives the person the immediate pleasure of hearing their name spoken by someone new. Second, I make a mental note about something distinctive about the person that I can connect to their name. Margaret might have a warm smile, so I think Margaret with the magnificent smile. Robert might be tall, so he becomes Robert the robust. These associations might seem silly, but they create mental hooks that make names unforgettable. Third, I use the name naturally throughout our conversation. Not obsessively, that would sound artificial, but whenever it flows naturally. "Margaret, that's fascinating." Or, "What do you think about that, Margaret?" Each time I use their name, I can see a subtle, positive response. People, literally, light up when they hear their own names spoken with respect and attention. The transformation in my social interactions was remarkable. People began responding to me with greater warmth and enthusiasm. They remembered me more clearly from one meeting to the next. They seemed more willing to engage in deeper conversations and more likely to seek me out at future gatherings. I realized that remembering names was particularly powerful for shy people because it gave us a concrete tool for connection. Instead of worrying about being charming or entertaining, we could focus on the simple act of learning about people and honoring them by remembering who they were. This shift from performance to attention made social interactions feel manageable and purposeful. The name technique also provided a natural conversation starter. "Margaret, I remember you mentioning last week that you were working on a new project. How is that going?" This kind of personalized attention makes people feel valued and creates the foundation for deeper relationships. One of the most surprising discoveries I made about likability came from an experiment I conducted entirely by accident. I was teaching a telephone sales course for businessmen who needed to improve their phone communication skills. Most of my students were struggling to connect with prospects over the phone, complaining that people seemed cold and unresponsive during their calls. During one class session, I noticed that Jim Morrison, one of my most successful students, had something different about his approach. While other students sat rigidly at their desks making practice calls, Jim was leaning back in his chair with a genuine smile on his face as he spoke. I could hear the warmth in his voice even from across the room. Curious about this observation, I asked the class to try an experiment. Half the students would make their practice calls while deliberately smiling, even though the person on the other end couldn't see them. The other half would make calls with their normal, serious expressions. We would track the responses they received. The results were astounding. The students who smiled while speaking reported dramatically better responses. Prospects stayed on the phone longer, seemed more interested in their offerings, and were significantly more likely to agree to meetings. Most surprisingly, several prospects commented on how friendly and warm the callers sounded, even though they had no visual cues whatsoever. This experiment taught me that a smile isn't just a facial expression, it's an entire shift in your internal state that affects everything about how you communicate. When you smile, even when no one can see you, something changes in your voice, your posture, your energy, and your entire presence. I began experimenting with smiling in my own daily interactions, and the transformation was remarkable. I discovered that there are actually different types of smiles, and each serves a different purpose in building connections with others. The first type is what I call the greeting smile, the warm, open expression you wear when first meeting someone. This isn't a forced grin, but a genuine expression of pleasure at meeting another human being. I practiced this smile until it became automatic, training myself to feel genuine curiosity and goodwill toward every new person I encountered. The second type is the recognition smile, the expression of delight when you see someone you know. I learned to let my face show authentic pleasure when greeting acquaintances, colleagues, and friends. People can sense the difference between a perfunctory greeting and one that conveys genuine happiness to see them. The third type is the listening smile, the subtle, encouraging expression you wear when someone is sharing something with you. This isn't about grinning inappropriately, but about letting your face reflect your interest and engagement with what they're saying. But here's what I discovered that most people don't understand. Authentic smiling starts from the inside. You can't fake genuine warmth for long, and people instinctively recognize the difference between a real smile and a manufactured one. The key is to cultivate genuine positive feelings toward other people. I trained myself to look for something genuinely appreciable in every person I met. Maybe it was their choice of tie, their thoughtful question, their obvious love for their children, or simply their willingness to engage in conversation. When you're actively looking for positive qualities in others, your smile becomes naturally authentic. For shy people, smiling serves an additional crucial function. It makes you appear approachable and friendly, even when you're feeling nervous or uncertain. People are naturally drawn to warmth, and a genuine smile signals that you're safe to approach and pleasant to be around. I also learned that smiling has a remarkable effect on your own emotional state. When you consciously choose to smile, especially during challenging social situations, it actually helps reduce anxiety and increases confidence. The physical act of smiling triggers positive neurological responses that make you feel more optimistic and capable. The smile became my secret weapon for opening doors, both literally and figuratively. It cost nothing, required no special training, and was available to anyone regardless of their background or circumstances. The most powerful lesson I ever learned about human connection came from an unlikely source, James J. Hill, the railroad baron who built the Great Northern Railway. I had the opportunity to spend an evening with him at a dinner party in New York, and what I observed that night revolutionized my understanding of what it means to be truly influential. Hill was not a physically imposing man, nor was he the loudest voice in the room, but I watched as person after person sought him out for conversation. Cabinet members, business leaders, and society figures all gravitated toward him throughout the evening. What struck me most was that Hill rarely spoke about himself or his accomplishments. Instead, he spent the entire evening asking questions and listening intently to the answers. I watched him speak with a young entrepreneur who was struggling to get his business off the ground. Rather than offering quick advice or talking about his own success, Hill asked probing questions. What aspect of your business gives you the most satisfaction? What challenges keep you awake at night? If you could change one thing about your industry, what would it be? For 20 minutes, this railroad magnate gave his complete attention to a man whose entire business was worth less than Hill probably spent on cigars in a month. The young entrepreneur walked away from that conversation glowing, telling everyone who would listen about the incredible wisdom James J. Hill had shared with him. But here's what fascinated me. Hill had shared almost no wisdom at all. He had simply really listened and asked thoughtful follow-up questions. The young man felt heard, understood, and valued, and he attributed those feelings to Hill's greatness as a person. This observation led me to experiment with what I came to call therapeutic listening, the practice of giving someone your complete, undivided attention with no agenda other than understanding their experience. I discovered that most people are so starved for genuine attention that when you provide it, they respond as if you've given them a precious gift. I began practicing 3 levels of listening in my interactions. The first level is polite listening, the words someone says while mentally preparing your response. This is how most people listen most of the time, and it creates only surface-level connections. The second level is active listening, focusing on both the words and the deep emotions behind them, asking clarifying questions and reflecting back what you're hearing. This creates deeper engagement and makes people feel understood. But the third level, what I call empathetic listening, is where transformation happens. This involves listening not just to what someone is saying, but to what they're not saying. You're attuned to their fears, hopes, dreams, and concerns that might be hiding beneath their words. You're listening for the person behind the conversation. I learned to listen for the story behind the story. When a colleague complained about a difficult project, I listened for their deeper concerns about job security or professional recognition. When a friend talked about their children's accomplishments, I heard their pride and their desire to be seen as a good parent. When someone described their weekend plans, I paid attention to what those plans revealed about their values and priorities. This kind of listening required me to set aside my own agenda completely. I couldn't be thinking about what I wanted to say next or how I could steer the conversation toward my own interests. I had to become genuinely curious about the other person's inner world and committed to understanding their perspective. The results were extraordinary. People began seeking me out for conversations. They would say things like, "I always feel better after talking with you," or "You really understand me." But I wasn't doing anything magically, was simply giving them something that had become rare in our busy, distracted world: my complete attention. I discovered that listening is particularly powerful for shy people because it plays to our natural strengths. While extroverts might be thinking about what they'll say next, introverts are often naturally more observant and attuned to others' emotional states. We can use this sensitivity as a superpower for creating deep connections. Listening also solves the shy person's dilemma of not knowing what to say. When you're genuinely focused on understanding someone else, the right questions and responses arise naturally. You're not performing or trying to impress. You're simply being present with another human being. I learned that people don't remember what you said as much as they remember how you made them feel. When you listen to someone with genuine interest and empathy, you make them feel valuable, understood, and appreciated. These feelings create lasting positive associations with you as a person. One of my most challenging tests of building connection came during a heated labor dispute at a steel mill where I had been called in to help mediate between management and workers. The union leader, a man named Mike O'Brien, had made it clear that he viewed me as just another management consultant sent to manipulate the workers into accepting unfair terms. Our first meeting was tense. O'Brien sat across from me with his arms crossed, his jaw set, and his eyes full of suspicion. He had agreed to meet only because the workers were demanding some kind of resolution, but everything about his posture said he expected this to be a waste of time. I could have tried to win him over with credentials or clever arguments, but instead, I decided to look for the human being behind the adversarial stance. I began by asking him about his background, not his position on the labor issues, but his personal story. "Mike, I'm curious about something. How did you end up working in the steel industry?" Something subtle shifted in his expression. He told me about growing up in a family of steelworkers, how his father had worked in the mills for 30 years before a workplace accident left him partially disabled. He spoke about starting work himself at 16 to help support his family, about the pride he felt in mastering a dangerous and demanding trade. As he talked, I found myself genuinely moved by his story. This wasn't just a union agitator. This was a man who understood from personal experience what it meant to risk your safety to earn a living, who had seen firsthand how quickly a worker's life could be derailed by an injury or an arbitrary decision by management. I shared my own background growing up poor on a Missouri farm, watching my parents struggle to make ends meet, understanding what it meant to work hard for every dollar. I talked about the lessons I had learned about dignity and fairness from my father, who, despite having very little, always treated everyone with respect. Gradually, the tension in the room began to ease. We weren't talking about labor contracts or negotiating positions. We were talking about shared values, the importance of hard work, the desire to provide for our families, the need to be treated with dignity and respect. I discovered that finding common ground isn't about agreeing on everything. It's about identifying the fundamental human experiences and values that connect us all. Even people who disagree strongly on specific issues often share deeper concerns and aspirations. Over the years, I developed a mental inventory of universal human experiences that I could draw upon in any conversation. Everyone has been proud of something they accomplished. Everyone has worried about someone they love. Everyone has faced disappointment and found ways to keep going. Everyone has dreams for their future or hopes for their children. These shared experiences become bridges that span differences in background, education, politics, or social status. When you help someone remember a moment of pride, or when you acknowledge a concern they have about their family, you're connecting on a level that transcends superficial differences. I learned to listen for values hidden beneath positions. The conservative businessman and the liberal activist might disagree completely about policy, but they might both share a deep concern for their children's future. The religious person and the atheist might have very different worldviews, but they might both value honesty and compassion in their relationships. For shy people, this approach is particularly valuable because it takes the pressure off being entertaining or impressive. Instead of trying to win people over with your personality, you're simply looking for the authentic ways you're already connected to them as fellow human beings. I also discovered that acknowledging differences honestly while emphasizing commonalities actually strengthens relationships. With Mike O'Brien, I never pretended to fully understand the daily reality of working in a dangerous mill, but I could understand the desire to be treated fairly and to provide for one's family. The labor dispute was eventually resolved, not because I was a brilliant negotiator, but because I had helped the different parties see each other as human beings with legitimate concerns rather than as adversaries to be defeated. Mike O'Brien and I remained friends for years afterward, despite coming from very different worlds. This experience taught me that common ground exists in every relationship if you're willing to look for it with genuine curiosity and respect. I learned the transformative power of sincere appreciation from observing a factory foreman named Bill Steinhardt, whose approach to managing workers was unlike anything I had ever seen. Bill supervised over 200 men in a steel fabrication plant, yet he had virtually no turnover, no labor disputes, and consistently the highest productivity rates in the company. What made Bill different wasn't his technical expertise or his management training, it was his genuine ability to see and acknowledge the value in every person who worked for him. I watched him walk through the factory floor each morning, and he had something specific and sincere to say to nearly every worker he encountered. To the man operating the crane, he might say, "Tom, that precision you showed yesterday, moving those beams into place, I've never seen anyone handle that equipment with such skill." To the welder working on a complex joint, he would comment, "The consistency of your work on these connections is remarkable, Joe. The quality inspectors tell me your joints are always perfect." What struck me about Bill's comments was their specificity. He wasn't offering generic praise like "good job" or "keep up the good work." He was demonstrating that he had noticed particular skills, efforts, or contributions that each person had made. He was seeing each worker as an individual with unique talents and contributions. I decided to study Bill's approach more closely, and I discovered something profound about human psychology. Everyone craves recognition for their efforts and contributions, but most people receive very little genuine appreciation in their daily lives. When someone takes the time to notice and acknowledge their specific value, the impact is extraordinary. I began experimenting with sincere appreciation in my own interactions, and I had to learn the crucial difference between flattery and genuine recognition. Flattery is telling someone what you think they want to hear in order to gain something from them. Appreciation is acknowledging something you genuinely value about their character, efforts, or contributions. The key to sincere appreciation is observation. You have to actually pay attention to people, to their efforts, their skills, their character traits, their contributions. Most of us are so focused on our own concerns that we miss opportunities to recognize the good in others. I learned to look for different types of contributions to acknowledge. Sometimes it was professional skill, the accountant's attention to detail, the salesperson's persistence, the secretary's organizational abilities. Sometimes it was character traits, someone's patience with a difficult customer, their willingness to help a colleague, their positive attitude during challenging times. Sometimes it was effort rather than results, recognizing that someone had worked hard on a project even if the outcome wasn't perfect, or acknowledging that someone had improved significantly even if they weren't the best performer overall. One of my most memorable experiences with appreciation involved a young secretary named Mary who worked in my office building. Mary was quiet and seemed to lack confidence in her abilities. Most people barely noticed her as she went about her daily tasks, but I began observing Mary's work more carefully, and I noticed that she had developed some remarkably efficient systems for organizing files and managing correspondence. Her desk was always perfectly organized, and she could locate any document. Within seconds, she had created filing systems that made everyone's job easier. One day, I made a point of telling Mary specifically what I had observed. "Mary, I've been watching how you've organized the correspondence system, and I'm impressed by your efficiency, the way you've categorized everything and created those quick reference guides has saved everyone in the office significant time. You have a real talent for organization and system building." The transformation in Mary was immediate and lasting. She stood a little taller, spoke with more confidence, and began offering suggestions for improving other office procedures. Other people began noticing her contributions and seeking her advice on organizational matters. Within 6 months, she had been promoted to office manager. This experience taught me that appreciation isn't just nice to give, it's often the catalyst that helps people recognize and develop their own potential. When you acknowledge someone's strengths, you help them see themselves more clearly and encourage them to build on those strengths. For shy people, learning to give sincere appreciation is particularly valuable because it shifts the focus away from ourselves and onto others. Instead of worrying about how we're coming across, we're looking for ways to make others feel valued and recognized. I discovered that the habit of looking for positive qualities in others also changes how we see the world. When you're actively searching for things to appreciate, you become more optimistic and positive in your general outlook. This positive energy is attractive to others and makes you someone people enjoy being around. The harshest lesson I ever received about handling criticism came from a newspaper review of one of my early public speaking courses. The critic, a man named William Patterson, who wrote for the Kansas City Journal, attended one of my classes and wrote what can only be described as a scathing review. "Mr. Carnegie's methods are simplistic," he wrote. "His examples are trivial, and his overall approach shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes genuine education. Anyone who pays money for this course would be better served reading a good book on rhetoric from their local library." Reading those words felt like being punched in the stomach. Here I was, trying to help people overcome the same fears and limitations I had struggled with, and this educated man was dismissing my life's work as worthless. My first instinct was to write an angry letter defending myself and my methods. My second instinct was to give up teaching altogether, but instead, I decided to examine why this criticism affected me so deeply. I realized that as a shy person, I had always been hypersensitive to any form of rejection or disapproval. Criticism felt like confirmation of my worst fears about myself, that I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or valuable enough to deserve respect and recognition. I began studying how confident people handled criticism, and I made a crucial discovery. They separated the criticism from their sense of self-worth. They could hear feedback about their work or their ideas without interpreting it as an attack on their fundamental value as human beings. I decided to respond to Mr. Patterson's criticism with an experiment. Instead of defending myself or attacking him in return, I wrote him a letter expressing genuine curiosity about his perspective. I thanked him for taking the time to attend my class and asked if he would be willing to share more specific suggestions for improvement. To my surprise, he agreed to meet with me. During our conversation, I discovered that his criticism wasn't really about my teaching methods, it was about his own frustration with what he saw as the decline of rigorous education. In America, he was a classical scholar who believed that shortcuts and simplification were undermining genuine learning. As we talked, I began to understand his perspective, and he began to understand mine. I wasn't trying to replace classical education. I was trying to help working people gain confidence and communication skills that no one had ever taught them. We were actually working towards similar goals, helping people improve their lives through learning, but from different approaches. This experience taught me several crucial principles about handling criticism constructively. First, criticism often says more about the critic than about you. People criticize from their own perspectives, experiences, and biases. Understanding where criticism comes from helps you evaluate how much weight to give it. Second, there's usually a grain of truth in most criticism, even harsh criticism. Mr. Patterson was right that my methods were simple, but that was intentional. I was trying to make communication skills accessible to people who had been intimidated by complex academic approaches. Third, responding to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness often transforms enemies into allies. By genuinely seeking to understand Mr. Patterson's concerns, I turned a hostile critic into someone who eventually sent students to my classes. I developed a mental framework for processing criticism that served me well throughout my career. When someone criticized my work, I would ask myself 3 questions. Is there truth in this criticism that I can learn from? Is this criticism coming from someone whose opinion I should value? And is this criticism about my work or about me as a person? For shy people, learning to handle criticism well is essential because we often avoid taking risks or putting ourselves forward specifically because we fear disapproval. But if you're going to grow and contribute, you have to be willing to face criticism and learn from it. I learned that the goal isn't to become immune to criticism, it's to become resilient in the face of it. You can feel hurt by unfair criticism while still maintaining your sense of self-worth. You can acknowledge valid points while rejecting invalid attacks on your character. Most importantly, I discovered that people respect those who can handle criticism gracefully more than those who never receive criticism at all. One of the most valuable lessons I learned about disagreeing without creating enemies came during a heated political debate at a dinner party in New York. The discussion was about labor relations, a topic on which I held strong opinions based on my experiences mediating workplace disputes. Seated across from me was Senator Harrison Mitchell, a man known for his rigid conservative views and his tendency to dominate conversations. He was holding forth about the laziness of American workers and the damage that unions were doing to the economy. Everything in me wanted to challenge his statements directly. Had seen firsthand how hard-working most laborers were, and how much they needed protection from unfair treatment. But I had learned that direct confrontation, especially in public settings, rarely changes minds and often creates lasting enmity. Instead, I tried an approach that seemed counterintuitive. I began by finding something in his position that I could genuinely acknowledge. "Senator Mitchell," I said, "I appreciate your concern for American competitiveness. We certainly need businesses to be profitable if they're going to provide good jobs for workers." This wasn't false flattery. Did believe that business success and worker welfare were ultimately connected, even though I disagreed with his proposed solutions. Having established this small area of agreement, I continued, "I'm curious about something, though. In your experience, have you found that workers respond better to criticism or to recognition?" I ask because I've noticed in my work that most people, including business leaders, tend to work harder when they feel valued and respected. Notice what I did here. Instead of attacking his position directly, I asked a question that invited him to think about the issue from a different angle. I wasn't telling him he was wrong. I was suggesting that there might be additional factors to consider. The senator paused, clearly thinking about the question. "Well," he said, "I suppose recognition does play a role. The best managers I know do tend to focus on bringing out the best in their people." "That's been my experience too," I replied. "I wonder if some of the labor problems we're seeing might be the result of workers feeling undervalued rather than inherently lazy? What do you think would happen if we approached these issues by looking for ways to help both sides succeed? What followed was one of the most productive political discussions I had ever witnessed. By avoiding direct confrontation and instead asking thoughtful questions, I had created space for the senator to reconsider his position without losing face. He didn't completely change his views, but he did acknowledge the complexity of the issues and the validity of some worker concerns. This experience taught me the magic phrase that disarms almost any argument. I wonder if, or what do you think would happen if, ... These phrases invite collaboration rather than combat. They suggest that you're interested in exploring solutions together rather than proving the other person wrong. I learned that shy people often have an advantage in disagreements because we're naturally less confrontational than aggressive personalities. We can use this tendency toward gentleness as a strength rather than seeing it as a weakness. The key is to separate the person from their position. You can disagree with someone's ideas while still respecting them as a human being. In fact, showing that you can disagree respectfully often increases people's respect for you. I developed several techniques for graceful disagreement. First, I always tried to understand the other person's perspective before presenting my own. What experiences or values led them to their position? What concerns were they trying to address? Second, I looked for shared values or goals beneath our different approaches. The senator and I both wanted America to prosper. We just had different ideas about how to achieve that prosperity. Third, I presented my disagreement as additional information to consider, rather than as proof that they were wrong. Here's another way to look at it. ... Or my experience has been different. ... These phrases are less threatening than you're wrong because ... This approach doesn't mean being wishy-washy or failing to stand up for your principles. Sometimes strong disagreement is necessary, but I learned that you can be firm in your convictions while still being respectful in your approach. My greatest networking triumph happened not at a business conference or cocktail party, but during a single evening at the Chicago Business Club, when I completely abandoned traditional networking advice and followed my introverted instincts instead. I had been invited to speak at their monthly dinner meeting, and afterward there was a reception where I was expected to mingle with potential clients and influential business leaders. The room was filled with the kind of confident, gregarious men who seemed to effortlessly work the crowd, moving from conversation to conversation with practiced ease. My usual approach would have been to try to meet as many people as possible, to make myself known to the most important people in the room, and to promote my speaking and training services. But standing at the edge of that buzzing room, I felt overwhelmed by the noise, the constant movement, and the pressure to perform. Instead of forcing myself to adopt an extroverted approach that felt unnatural, I decided to honor my introverted preferences. I found a quiet corner near the fireplace and simply made myself available for deeper conversations with whoever approached me. The first person who came over was Robert Sinclair, a middle-aged banker who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. Instead of launching into my usual introduction about my work, I asked him about his experience at the evening's presentation. "What did you think about the discussion on business leadership?" I inquired. For the next 20 minutes, we had a thoughtful conversation about the challenges of motivating employees, the changing nature of business, relationships, and his concerns about the future of banking. I learned about his struggles with a particular department that was underperforming, his frustration with communication breakdowns in his organization, and his genuine desire to be a better leader rather than immediately pitching my services. I focused entirely on understanding his situation and offering whatever insights I could from my experience. I asked thoughtful questions about his challenges and shared relevant stories from my work with other organizations, not as sales presentations, but as potentially helpful perspectives. By the end of our conversation, Robert had not only invited me to conduct training for his bank, but had also offered to introduce me to several other business leaders who might benefit from my services. More importantly, we had formed a genuine connection that would develop into a long-term friendship and business relationship. This pattern repeated throughout the evening. Instead of working the room, I let the room work me. People who were also seeking refuge from the overwhelming social energy found their way to my quiet corner. Each conversation was deeper and more meaningful than the superficial exchanges I observed happening elsewhere in the room. I realized that traditional networking advice is designed for extroverts, people who gain energy from social interaction, and who are comfortable with quick, surface-level conversations. But introverts, like myself, actually have significant advantages in building business relationships if we approach networking differently. First, introverts are naturally better at listening, which is exactly what most people crave in professional settings, while extroverts are often thinking about what they'll say next. Introverts are usually paying closer attention to what others are actually saying. Second, introverts prefer depth over breadth in relationships, which leads to stronger, more lasting professional connections, rather than having superficial acquaintances with hundreds of people. Introverts tend to develop meaningful relationships with smaller numbers of people who become genuine advocates and collaborators. Third, introverts are often more thoughtful and less pushy in their approach, which makes them more trustworthy and approachable for people who are tired of being networked by aggressive self-promoters. I developed a networking approach that played to these strengths. Instead of trying to meet everyone, I focused on having meaningful conversations with a few people. Instead of talking about myself, I concentrated on learning about others and their challenges. Instead of immediate sales pitches, I offered genuine value through insights, resources, or connections. I also learned to prepare for networking events differently. Rather than bringing a stack of business cards and a mental list of people to meet, I prepared thoughtful questions that would help me understand others' work and challenges. I researched the attendees when possible so I could ask informed questions about their industries or organizations. Most importantly, I learned to choose networking environments that suited my personality. Large, noisy cocktail parties were never going to be my strength, but smaller professional dinners, educational seminars, and industry conferences where I could have more substantial conversations worked much better. The result was that I built a professional network based on genuine relationships rather than superficial contacts. These relationships became the foundation of my career success, providing not just business opportunities but also lifelong friendships and collaborations. My most challenging test of leadership came when I was reluctantly appointed chairman of a committee tasked with reorganizing the YMCA's educational programs. I say reluctantly because everything in my nature preferred to support others' initiatives rather than spearhead my own. The committee consisted of 12 strong-willed individuals, including several successful businessmen who were accustomed to being in charge. My first instinct was to defer to their experience and expertise, but I quickly realized that without clear leadership, the committee would fragment into competing factions, each pushing their own agenda. The traditional approach would have been to assert my authority, set the agenda, and drive the group toward predetermined goals. But this aggressive style felt completely foreign to my personality. Instead, I decided to experiment with what I came to call leadership from behind, a style that honored my natural inclinations while still providing the direction the group needed. My first innovation was to begin each meeting not by presenting my ideas, but by asking each member what they hoped we would accomplish. Robert, What would success look like to you in this reorganization? Margaret, what concerns do you have about the current programs? This approach served multiple purposes. It gave everyone a voice. It helped me understand the different perspectives I was dealing with, and it made each person feel valued and heard. I discovered that one of the most powerful things a leader can do is ask the right questions rather than provide all the answers. Instead of saying, "Here's what we need to do," I would ask, "What do you think would happen if we tried this approach? Or how do you think our members would respond to that change?" This questioning style accomplished something remarkable. It got people thinking creatively about solutions rather than defensively about their positions. When people feel that their ideas are being sought rather than their compliance being demanded, they become collaborators rather than subordinates. I also learned to facilitate rather than dominate discussions. My role became helping the group think through issues together rather than convincing them to accept my predetermined solutions. I would summarize different viewpoints, identify areas of agreement, and help the group work through disagreements constructively. For example, when we were debating whether to offer more practical vocational training or continue focusing on classical education, instead of advocating for one side, I helped the group explore the question, how can we serve both the members who need job skills and those who want intellectual enrichment? This approach led to innovative solutions that none of us had considered initially. We developed a program structure that offered both tracks, with opportunities for crossover between them. The solution was better than what any individual member had originally proposed because it incorporated insights from the entire group. I discovered that quiet leaders often have significant advantages over more dominant personalities. We're typically better listeners, more observant of group dynamics, and more sensitive to when someone feels excluded or unheard. These skills are invaluable in building consensus and maintaining group cohesion. I also learned that you can project authority without being authoritarian. Authority comes from competence, preparation, and genuine concern for the group's success, not from volume or aggression. I made sure I was thoroughly prepared for every meeting, that I understood the issues we were discussing, and that I had thoughtfully considered different perspectives when decisions needed to be made. I learned to present them as the group's decisions rather than my decisions. It sounds like we've reached consensus that ... or based on our discussion, it seems we agree that ... This approach made people feel ownership of the decisions, rather than resentment about being told what to do. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to lead through service rather than command. My focus was always on helping the group succeed rather than on establishing my own importance. This meant sometimes advocating for unpopular but necessary decisions, sometimes mediating conflicts between strong personalities, and sometimes taking responsibility for failures while sharing credit for successes. The committee's work was ultimately successful. We created an educational program that served the diverse needs of our membership and became a model for other YMCA branches. But more importantly, the experience taught me that there are many different ways to lead effectively, and that quiet, collaborative leadership can be just as powerful as more traditional authoritarian approaches. This style of leadership suited my personality while still achieving the results that aggressive leadership might have accomplished, but with greater buy-in, less resistance, and stronger long-term relationships among the team members. My courtship of Dorothy Price, who later became my wife, taught me that romantic success for shy people requires a completely different approach than the bold, aggressive tactics that seemed to work for more extroverted men. When I first met Dorothy at a church social gathering in New York, I was immediately attracted to her intelligence and warmth, but I felt completely out of my league. She was poised, well-educated, and surrounded by confident suitors who seemed to effortlessly charm her with witty conversation and grand, romantic gestures. My first instinct was to compete with these men on their own terms, to try to be more clever, more charming, more entertaining than they were. But every attempt at witty banter fell flat. Every effort to impress her with grand gestures felt forced and unnatural. I was trying to be someone I wasn't, and both Dorothy and I could sense the artificiality. The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to compete and started being authentically myself. Instead of attempting to dazzle Dorothy with clever conversation, I began asking genuine questions about her interests and opinions. I discovered she was passionate about literature and social reform, subjects about which I knew relatively little, but found genuinely fascinating when seen through her eyes. Rather than pretending to expertise I didn't possess, I admitted my ignorance and asked her to teach me. Dorothy, I've never read Jane Austen, but I can see how much her work means to you. What is it about her writing that speaks to you so deeply? This honest curiosity led to our first real conversation, one that lasted for over 2 hours and covered everything from literature to social justice to our dreams for the future. I learned that Dorothy was tired of men who seemed more interested in impressing her than in understanding her. The other suitors talked about themselves, their accomplishments, their grand plans. I listened to her thoughts, her concerns, her aspirations. While they tried to demonstrate their worthiness, I focused on discovering her worth. My courtship strategy became built around thoughtful attention rather than dramatic gestures. Instead of sending expensive flowers, I would send books by authors she had mentioned wanting to read, with handwritten notes about passages that reminded me of our conversations. Instead of taking her to the most fashionable restaurants, I would plan quiet walks in the park where we could talk without distraction. I discovered that many women, especially thoughtful ones like Dorothy, were hungry for genuine emotional connection. They could get wit and charm from any number of men, but deep listening and authentic interest were much rarer commodities. One of my most successful romantic strategies was what I called remembering forward. I would pay attention to small details. Dorothy mentioned a book she wanted to read, a place she hoped to visit, a cause she cared about, and then follow up on these interests weeks or even months later. This demonstrated that our conversations mattered enough to me to remember and act upon. For example, she once mentioned in passing that she had always wanted to see a particular art exhibition, but couldn't find anyone who shared her interest. 2 weeks later, I surprised her with tickets to that exhibition, not as a grand romantic gesture, but as evidence that I had been listening and that her interests were important to me. I also learned that vulnerability could be more attractive than strength when shared appropriately. Instead of trying to appear perfect and invulnerable, I occasionally shared my own uncertainties and struggles. I told Dorothy about my ongoing battle with shyness, my fears about public speaking, my insecurities, about my background. This honesty created intimacy in ways that boastfulness never could. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to court Dorothy's mind and heart rather than just trying to win her affection. I was genuinely interested in her thoughts about literature, her passion for social reform, her observations about human nature. I wanted to know not just that she cared about helping disadvantaged children, but why this cause mattered to her, and how she thought problems might be solved. This approach worked because it honored both Dorothy's intelligence and my own natural inclinations toward depth and thoughtfulness. Our relationship developed on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine interest rather than performance and conquest. When I finally proposed to Dorothy, it wasn't with a dramatic speech or elaborate setting. I simply told her, honestly and directly, that I couldn't imagine building a life with anyone but her, and that I hoped she felt the same way about me. Her yes came not because I had overwhelmed her with charm, but because we had built a connection based on authenticity and mutual understanding. When my daughter Donna was born, I faced a new challenge that terrified me more than any public speaking engagement. How could a naturally shy father raise a confident child in a world that seemed to reward only the boldest personalities? My fears intensified when I noticed that Donna had inherited my sensitive temperament. She was a thoughtful, observant child who preferred quiet play to boisterous activities, who took time to warm up to new people, and who seemed overwhelmed by loud, chaotic environments. My heart ached watching her at birthday parties, standing at the edge of the group while more aggressive children dominated the games and conversations. My first instinct was to push her toward more extroverted behavior. I enrolled her in activities designed to bring her out of her shell: dance classes, group sports, drama clubs. I encouraged her to speak up more, to be more assertive, to stop being so shy. But I could see that my efforts were making her more self-conscious, not more confident. The turning point came during a conversation I'll never forget. Donna was 8 years old, and she had come home from school upset because her teacher had criticized her for being too quiet during class discussions. "Daddy," she asked me with tears in her eyes, "why can't I be like the other kids? Why do I have to be so shy?" In that moment, I realized I had been sending her the wrong message entirely. By trying to change her fundamental temperament, I was inadvertently telling her that who she naturally wasn't good enough. Instead of building her confidence, I was undermining it. I sat down with Donna and shared something I had never told her before: the story of my own childhood struggles with shyness, how ashamed I had felt about my quiet nature, and how I had eventually learned that sensitivity was actually a gift, not a burden. "Donna," I told her, "some of the most remarkable people in the world are quiet observers like you and me. We see things that louder people miss. We think deeply about ideas that others rush past. We care deeply about people's feelings in ways that help us be better friends and helpers." I began pointing out the strengths that came with her temperament. She was an excellent listener who remembered details about her friends' lives that others forgot. She was creative and imaginative, spending hours drawing pictures and making up stories. She was kind and empathetic, always noticing when someone seemed sad or left out. Rather than pushing her to be more extroverted, I started helping her develop confidence within her natural personality. We practiced what I called quiet confidence, the ability to express her thoughts and feelings clearly and kindly, even if she didn't want to be the center of attention. I taught her that there were many ways to participate in group activities without being the loudest voice. She could contribute by asking thoughtful questions, by listening carefully and building on others' ideas, by offering help to classmates who were struggling. These were valuable social skills that would serve her well throughout life. We also worked on what I called preparation confidence. Before social situations that might be challenging for her, we would talk through what might happen and how she could handle different scenarios. If she was nervous about a new class, we would discuss what she might say when introducing herself, or how she could approach a potential friend. Most importantly, I learned to model the behavior I wanted her to develop. Instead of hiding my own introverted tendencies, I began showing her how a quiet person could be effective and respected. She watched me prepare thoughtfully for important conversations, ask genuine questions about others' experiences, and contribute meaningfully to discussions without dominating them. I made sure she saw me in situations where my natural strengths were valued: leading small group discussions, mentoring individuals, writing thoughtful letters to friends. She learned that success didn't require changing your personality. It required developing your personality's natural strengths. The transformation in Donna was gradual but profound. She never became an extrovert, but she developed genuine confidence in her ability to connect with others and contribute to her community. She learned to speak up when she had something important to say, to form deep friendships based on mutual understanding, and to use her natural empathy to help others feel valued and heard. Years later, Donna told me that the most important lesson I had taught her was that being different wasn't being deficient. She learned that the world needed both bold leaders and thoughtful observers, both dynamic speakers and careful listeners. Her job wasn't to become someone else. It was to become the best version of herself. My greatest professional triumph came not through aggressive self-promotion or dominating boardroom presentations, but through a quiet approach that played to my natural strengths during a crucial CORPORATE consulting engagement with International Harvester Corporation. The company was struggling with massive communication breakdowns between management and workers, resulting in productivity problems and labor unrest. They had hired several consultants before me, all of whom had recommended bold, dramatic changes that required charismatic leadership to implement. None of these approaches had worked. When I walked into my first meeting with the executive team, I could sense their skepticism. Here was another consultant, and this one seemed even less impressive than his predecessor's quiet, unassuming, asking more questions than he answered. I could see them thinking, how is this soft-spoken man going to solve problems that more dynamic consultants couldn't fix? But I had learned that real professional success comes not from commanding attention, but from delivering genuine value. Instead of trying to impress them with my expertise, I spent the first several meetings simply listening and learning. I interviewed workers on the factory floor, middle managers caught between competing pressures, and executives frustrated by their inability to connect with their workforce. What I discovered was that the communication problems weren't really about systems or procedures, they were about human relationships. Workers felt unheard and unvalued. Managers felt overwhelmed and unsupported. Executives felt frustrated and misunderstood. Everyone was talking, but no one was really listening. My solution wasn't a dramatic reorganization or a motivational campaign. Instead, I proposed a series of small, carefully designed interventions that would help people at different levels of the organization really hear each other. I started with the executive team, teaching them the listening skills I had learned over years of working with people. Not just polite listening, but the kind of deep, empathetic attention that makes people feel genuinely understood. I showed them how to ask questions that drew out real concerns rather than just surface complaints. Next, I worked with middle managers, helping them develop the confidence to communicate both upward and downward in the organization. Many of these managers were naturally introverted people who had been promoted based on their technical competence but had never been taught how to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. Finally, I facilitated a series of carefully structured conversations between different levels of the organization. These weren't dramatic confrontations or emotional encounters, but thoughtful dialogues designed to help each group understand the others' perspectives and challenges. The results were remarkable, but they unfolded gradually rather than dramatically. Productivity began to improve as workers felt more heard and valued. Management decisions were implemented more smoothly because employees understood the reasoning behind them. Labor tensions decreased as both sides began to see each other as human beings with legitimate concerns rather than adversaries to be defeated. The International Harvester executives were amazed by the transformation, but they were even more surprised by my approach. We expected you to come in with grand strategies and inspirational speeches, the CEO told me. Instead, you just helped us learn to listen to each other. How did you know that's what we needed? The answer was that my years of being naturally observant and empathetic had taught me to see patterns that more aggressive consultants missed. While they were focused on implementing their own ideas, I was focused on understanding what the organization really needed. This experience taught me that professional success for quiet people comes from developing our natural strengths, rather than trying to compete with extroverts on their terms. We may never be the most charismatic presenters or the most dynamic networkers, but we can become the most trusted advisors. the most insightful analysts, and the most effective problem solvers. I learned to position myself as the person who could see what others missed, who could understand complex situations from multiple perspectives, and who could facilitate solutions that worked for everyone involved. This wasn't about being modest or self-effacing. It was about being genuinely valuable in ways that aligned with my natural temperament. Over the years, I discovered that many of the most successful people in business weren't the loudest voices in the room, but the ones who consistently delivered results through careful preparation, thoughtful analysis, and genuine concern for others' success. The corporate world needed people who could think deeply, listen carefully, and build consensus quietly. My professional reputation grew not because I learned to be more extroverted, but because I learned to be exceptionally good at the things that came naturally to me. Clients sought me out not for inspirational speeches, but for insights that could only come from patient observation and careful analysis. The key was recognizing that there are many different ways to add value in professional settings, and that quiet competence is often more valuable than flashy charisma. The goal wasn't to become someone else. It was to become so good at being myself that my natural approach became my professional advantage. As I write this final chapter, looking back on a life that took me from a terrified farm boy to someone who taught millions of people how to connect with others, I want to share the most important lesson I learned. The world doesn't need you to become an extrovert, it needs you to become the best version of who you already are. If I could write a letter to my younger self, sitting in that Missouri farmhouse, feeling ashamed of his quiet nature, I would tell him that his sensitivity wasn't a weakness to overcome, but a strength to develop. Those moments of careful observation, that tendency to think before speaking, that deep concern for others' feelings, these weren't obstacles to success, but the very qualities that would eventually help him connect with people in meaningful ways. The journey from crippling shyness to confident authenticity taught me that there's a crucial difference between being shy and being introverted, between lacking confidence and preferring depth over breadth in social interactions. Shyness is often rooted in fear and self-consciousness, but introversion is simply a preference for how you process information and recharge your energy. I learned that you can overcome shyness without abandoning introversion. You can develop the skills to speak confidently in public, to lead teams effectively, and to build strong professional relationships while still honoring your need for quiet reflection, meaningful conversation, and thoughtful preparation. The principles I discovered and taught genuine interest in others, careful listening, sincere appreciation, remembering names, finding common ground. These aren't extroverted skills. They're human skills that actually come more naturally to people who are observant, empathetic, and thoughtful about relationships. In fact, I came to believe that many of the world's most pressing problems stem from too much talking and not enough listening, too much self-promotion and not enough genuine interest in others, too much surface-level networking and not enough deep relationship building. The qualities that make someone naturally introverted are often exactly what our communities and organizations need most. Throughout my career, I watched naturally quiet people transform their lives not by becoming loud and aggressive, but by learning to express their authentic selves with confidence and skill. They learned to speak up when they had something valuable to contribute, to form deep professional relationships based on mutual respect, and to lead through collaboration and consensus building rather than dominance and charisma. I also learnt that the goal isn't to eliminate nervousness or discomfort in social situations. It's to develop the ability to act effectively despite those feelings. Even after decades of public speaking and teaching, I still felt nervous before important presentations. The difference was that I no longer let those feelings prevent me from doing what needed to be done. The most profound realization of my later years was that authenticity is more attractive than performance. People can sense when you're trying to be someone you're not, and they're drawn to those who are comfortable in their own skin. The charm that comes from genuine interest in others, from real empathy and concern, from thoughtful consideration of their needs and feelings. This kind of appeal is more lasting and meaningful than the superficial charisma of people who are simply good at commanding attention. My legacy isn't that I taught shy people to become extroverts. My legacy is that I showed people how to connect with others authentically, how to influence through service rather than manipulation, and how to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine caring. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in my early struggles, I want you to know that your quiet nature isn't something to apologize for or overcome. It's something to develop and express with confidence. The world needs your thoughtfulness, your empathy, your ability to listen deeply and observe carefully. Your journey isn't about becoming someone else, it's about becoming so skilled at being yourself that your natural approach becomes your greatest strength. You don't need to change your personality. You need to develop your personality's potential. The shy farm boy who could barely speak to his classmates eventually taught millions of people how to communicate effectively. But he did it not by abandoning his sensitive nature, but by learning to channel that sensitivity into genuine connection with others. That same transformation is available to you, not through becoming louder or more aggressive, but through becoming more skilled at expressing the valuable person you already are. The world is waiting for your contribution, delivered in your own authentic voice.